Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca and welcome to another installment of Fotog Friday. Last week was my first video and I really appreciated all the feedback I got, which motivated me to keep going and make another video about shutter speed. Last week we talked about shutter speed inside the camera, how it works, what goes on in the camera, and today we're going to take those same principles and apply them to pictures. So we're going to talk about three things that shutter speed affects. We'll go over how it affects exposure, we'll go over how it affects motion and blur and movement in your images, and then I'm also going to share with you one of my favorite tips that I learned when I was first starting to shoot about focal length and shutter speed. Something that's a really good rule of thumb if you're not really sure why your images are looking kind of fuzzy and certain things like that. This may be a good solution that will help you out. So let's get started. First we'll talk about how shutter speed affects exposure. I'll pull up this image here. This is probably what I would say is a pretty decent exposure, what I would want to capture this image at. And just to show you over here, you can see my settings are, I shot this at ISO 200 on my 50mm lens at f-stop 1.4, and this was shot at 1/2000th of a second, so a fraction of a second, 1/2000th, really fast shutter speed. I shot this outside, and although it was shaded, it was very bright outside, so in order to get this exposure the way that I liked it, I had to shoot at a pretty fast shutter speed. So in order to show you how shutter speed affects an image, I kept all of the other factors of the image the same. The ISO is at 200 and the f-stop is at 1.4 for all of these images. The only thing that I changed is the shutter speed. So I'm going to back up down here. This was shot at 1/8000th of a second. I know the number got bigger, but it actually is faster because we're talking about fractions. So if you have 1/2 versus 1/100, 1/2, even though 2 is a smaller number than 100, it's actually more time. Half of a second is a lot slower and a lot more time than 1/100th of a second, which is just 1%. So you just have to remember that shutter speed is done in fractions. When you look at the numbers, the time gets longer as the number gets smaller, or at least the number on the bottom of the fraction. So as long as you have that in mind, you'll understand how shutter speed works. So this was at 1/8000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, 1/1000th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second, 1/125th of a second, and 1/60th of a second. So like I mentioned before, all of the factors stayed the same except for the shutter speed. And you can see here clearly the exposure changes a lot as you change the shutter speed across the range, across the spectrum. So now that we've talked about how shutter speed affects exposure, we're going to shift gears a little bit and I'm going to talk about how shutter speed affects motion and movement. So the easiest way to really demonstrate this is to take pictures of moving objects. So I walked down the road and I took some pictures of cars driving by to hopefully better explain to you and demonstrate for you how shutter speed affects capturing movement. This first image was shot at 1/3200th of a second, or 1/3200. Basically, it's a tiny fraction, meaning the shutter speed was super fast. Even though this car looks like it's parked, believe it or not, it's actually driving and moving at about 30 miles an hour. That's what happens when you shoot at a really fast shutter speed. Even if something is moving by you very quickly, that's how you capture something really instantaneously. These are the kind of shutter speeds that photographers at sporting events have to shoot at in order to capture those crisp moments in sports. I mean, because if you think about it, think about a running back running down the field with the football, making that touchdown. They're moving at really fast speeds, and these photographers are shooting from far away. So in order to capture that as crisp as they do, they have to shoot at really fast shutter speeds. We'll shift gears a little bit. This next picture was shot at 1/500th of a second. Still a really fast shutter speed, but already because of the speed that the cars were driving by, it already looks slightly blurry. And this is still a very fast shutter speed. So it just goes to show that the faster something is moving, if you really want to capture that crisply, the faster your shutter speed needs to be. We'll keep going down the scale. Next one, this is at 1/100th of a second. And now you can really start to see some blur. You can really start to see that the car was moving. I shot all of these on a tripod, so that's why the background is in focus and is crisp. The things that weren't moving are still very sharp, but because the car was driving at about 30 miles an hour, you see some movement. Then I dropped down to 1/50th of a second, and this is where you can even more see the movement, see how fast the car is driving by. And lastly, I dropped all the way down to 1/20th of a second, and clearly you can see how fast this car is driving. So there's a big difference between shooting at a slower shutter speed or a faster shutter speed. So now that you've seen how shutter speed affects motion and movement and how it captures different types of motion, I'm going to show you how that applies to the type of photography I do, which is wedding and engagement photography. The first is an example of an engagement shoot I did last fall in New York City. The couple wanted to shoot in the subway, and I knew that with the subway trains moving, I wanted to capture some element of movement. So what I told the couple to do is I wanted them to stand up against this post, and I just said, be really into each other, you can kiss if you want or nuzzle up against each other, but be as still as possible when the train is going by. I knew that I wanted to capture it at an open shutter speed, a pretty fast shutter speed, so that I could get the movement of the subway train. But with that, I also knew that if they moved too much, that they would also be blurred as well. So as soon as the subway train started whizzing by, I said, be still as possible, and they held their pose really, really well. And because of that, I was able to capture the subway train moving with that nice blur, that nice motion, but still have Caitlin and Casey crisp in the picture. This was shot at 1/40th of a second, and because I had a couple that was really good at staying still, I was able to achieve what I wanted and the effects that I wanted. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm going to show you how shutter speed can actually be a negative thing, just depending on how you use it, and some things to look out for when you're shooting in low light situations, particularly in my case at wedding ceremonies. This picture is from Angel and AJ's wedding. This is during their recessional, and this was shot at 1/50th of a second. If I could redo this picture, I probably would have shot it at a faster shutter speed, because as you can see here, although AJ is crisply in focus, Angel's a little bit blurred, and it's because they're walking and they're moving down the aisle. I was already shooting at 1600 ISO because there were no windows in this church. If I could redo this image, I would have made my shutter speed faster and bumped up my ISO even more. I know because of doing that, I would be sacrificing some quality, but for me, it's worth it in order to capture this moment as crisply as possible. So it's important to remember in low light settings, particularly when people are moving, that you need to be aware of your shutter speed and not dip down below 1/50th of a second. Otherwise, you're going to capture some blur, especially if people are walking very quickly. The last thing we're going to talk about today is shutter speed and focal length. Generally speaking, it's pretty much understood by most photographers that it's not really possible to shoot slower than 1/30th of a second without seeing some movement in your images, simply due to the fact that once you're shooting at a slower and slower shutter speed, any little movement you make, even if it's breathing, even the pressing of the shutter, all of those can affect your images. So here are some examples. This image here was shot at 1/100th of a second. I focused in right here on the bottle, and as you can see, once this renders, that it's pretty crisp. And these were all shot handheld, so pretty much you can sure that at 1/100th of a second, you're going to be pretty crisp. I dropped down to 1/60th of a second, pretty much the same thing. It's in focus, it's crisp, pretty good. So now I dipped down to 1/30th of a second, and this is pretty much as low as I would recommend going handheld. I was shooting at a 50mm lens, so even here you can start to see that it's a little bit soft. This is at 1/30th of a second, and it's not bad, but I definitely would recommend at least, this is back to 1/60th of a second, at least shooting here. So this is back down to 1/30th of a second, and now we'll go even slower. This is at 1/15th of a second. It looks fine like this, but once you zoom in, you can really see how soft this is, and this was my area of focus, so this is supposed to be pretty crisp. I'll zoom back out. This is 1/8th of a second. Again, the image as a whole doesn't look too bad, but when you zoom in, you can really start to see the movement. And I was trying to shoot these as still as possible, but they are handheld, and this is the result when you're shooting at that slow of a shutter speed. Drop down even more. This is 1/4th of a second. Now you can really see, even in the whole image, just how blurry it is. Zoom in, it's no question. I mean, this is this is a lot of movement, and 1/2 of a second. So I actually was able to shoot this one a little bit better than the 1/4 of a second, but even still, that movement is just unacceptable. So this is a good demonstration. I'll go back up. This is 1/100th of a second, and you can see quite a difference in how crisp this is. I shot these images side by side, handheld, all in the same way. So this is a really good demonstration of how shutter speed affects motion when you're shooting slower and slower and slower. Even though nothing is moving in the image, because you as a human, I mean, we're not tripods, so we move, we breathe, we press the shutter, and it all affects how the image is captured, and it affects blur and movement and things like that. The last thing that's a tip that I absolutely love to remember when it comes to focal length and shutter speed is that your focal length really is a good determiner of how slow your shutter speed should really be able to go before you see some blur. For example, if you're shooting at 100 millimeters, generally speaking, the general rule of thumb is that if you shoot slower than 1/100th of a second, you're going to start to see some of that same blur and movement. Same thing with 300 millimeters. If you're shooting at 300 millimeters, if you dip any lower than 1/320th of a second, you're going to really start to see some blur and movement. The reason for that is because the longer your focal length, the farther you're reaching, and any little movement is going to show up more and more. In the same way, if you're shooting with a 35 millimeter lens, you can probably shoot at 1/30th of a second and not really see it affect blur or movement too much. So it's not a definite rule. It's just a good rule of thumb to know when you're out there shooting and you're wondering why. You're like, well, Rebecca, you said if you shoot more than 1/30th of a second, you won't see camera shake. It's not necessarily true. If you're shooting with a really long lens at a really long focal length, chances are you're going to have to get your shutter speed even faster in order to eliminate any of that blur or movement. So it's just a rule of thumb to think about, something that definitely helped me out a lot, and I really appreciated knowing. I really appreciate you stopping by today. Next video, we're going to talk about aperture and talk about what it is and how it works. So I hope you'll join me next week for that video. But for now, I hope you have a wonderful Friday and a fantastic weekend.
Don't sweat the technique.